Thank you to Martin and the HNR conference team for the invitation to talk. I'll be sharing today a survey of 3 projects I've been involved with since around 2011, beginning with a modest study of 289 letters and continuing to my present project, which brings together approaching 500,000 letters. This work is the result of collective labour, primarily with my longtime collaborator and husband, Sebastian Ahnert, but also with Lotte Vickers, Josie Cree, and the Networking Archives project team, past and present. The journey through these 3 projects is more than just a survey, however. Each of these projects presents a peculiar set of problems related to the scale and to the origin of the data, which were instructive for scholars working on historical network analysis. It considers the benefits of hand-curated data, the problems of working with large data sets created by digitisation projects with imposed data structures and inadequate data cleaning, and the challenges of joining up hundreds of individual catalogues. With ever larger data sets, we are presented with increased potential. That potential can be harnessed by computational tools to render these archives navigable. But there are also a set of trade-offs that digital historians need to make when adopting these, and these trade-offs become greater at each scale of project. The reason to work with letters is perhaps self-evident. They are a form of historical document that is inherently relational. Their importance in the early modern world, however, may need some explanation for those audience members not familiar with the period. As Gary Schneider puts it, early modern letters were sociotexts. They were crucial material bearers of social connection, instruments by which social ties were initiated, negotiated, and consolidated. Moreover, letter networks can tell us about how communities defined themselves in resistance to other groups and how governments carried out their business. The idea that letters could be studied using methods from the field of network science first occurred to me in 2008 when Sebastian had a visiting fellowship at Laszlo Barabassi's lab, the Centre for Complex Network Research at Northeastern, and I started reading up on the field. At that time, I was completing a thesis that included analysis of the letters of the Marian martyrs, which were primarily held at Emmanuel College Library in Cambridge. These were a body of secret correspondence written by Protestants in England during Mary I's Catholic reign, 1553 to 1558. Many were sent to and from prisoners who would go on to be martyred, and their lives documented in the famous Book of Martyrs by John Foxe. These would come to be the first study that Sebastian and I undertook. We gathered the data entirely manually from these undigitized sources by me going to the library and reading the letters, recording the senders and recipients of each letter, the date and place of sending, and any relational information contained within the body of the letters. This is what we might call hand-curated metadata. While manual data collection is not often an option for very large archives, it has clear benefits in smaller studies because of these attributes. It's probably pretty clean. You can ensure that people and places referred to use a consistent name, title, and spelling throughout. You've got control over your data structure and fields you record to answer your very specific research questions. You can encode things like different edge types. So we had 11 different edge types in our data, marking things not only like the passage of a letter between 2 people, but speculative letter links, commendations sent in letters, references to a conversation, spousal links. And using a manual approach allows you to analyze in detail the document contents. That little project resulted in an article which is referenced at the bottom of the screen, which showed that from the 289 unique letters, we can construct a network of 377 individuals and 795 edges marked by or reported in a letter. Even with a relatively small dataset like this, however, quantitative analyses were necessary to reveal its underlying structure. We use a number of fairly basic measures such as degree and betweenness centrality. Degree, simply put, is the number of connections a given person has, and they're marked here in red. What we found was that the people with the highest degree turned out to be the Protestant leaders. That is, the martyrs whose lives were immortalized in Foxe's Book of Martyrs and have been covered so fulsomely in existing historiography. So far, so obvious. However, by analysing the network using another very standard network metric, betweenness centrality, we got a different insight into the infrastructure of these communications. Betweenness measures the number of shortest paths in the network that pass through a given individual. In other words, these are people with the most infrastructural significance. What we found, and these high betweenness people are marked here in green, was that these people turned out to be the sustainers of the network. They were the kinds of people who were letter couriers and a category of financial sustainers that was mostly made up of female supporters who've largely been overlooked in existing scholarship. We were also keen to understand how that network changed over time, as this was a highly unstable network due to the fact that many Protestant leaders were executed during Mary's reign. We expected that as time passed and those nodes were removed, the network would fragment. But let's see what happens if we execute these figures again. What we see is that the network thins out considerably, but it hangs together at its core. Despite the large number of executions, the network does not fragment. And this is because the prisoners created a community with a powerful infrastructure maintained by those sustainers, those unsung couriers and women who supported the prisoners financially and emotionally. Buoyed by the success of our first project, Sebastian and I decided to scale up our next project very slightly in terms of data size. Tudor Networks of Power is an AHRC-funded project that analyses the letters held in the state papers during the period from the accession of Henry VIII to the death of Elizabeth I. These were digitised in 2008 for State Papers Online, a resource owned by the company Gale, who very kindly supplied us with the underlying XML and images. We're focusing on the correspondence once again, and that is almost 133,000 items, connecting 20,656 individuals, including people not only across England, but Europe and beyond. This is an example of extracted data from something that we might describe as a single archive, although that boundedness is actually much more complex than it initially seems, and we can talk about that during the questions if people are interested. The attributes of extracted data is it can be much, and indeed much larger in scale than the hand-curated data. But the problem is that it's relying on other people's data structures, and it typically requires more in-depth cleaning. And these features might in turn restrict the questions that you're able to ask and to answer. In this specific case, the fields that we needed to clean were people's names and place names. And we also needed to add a number of fields, including geo-coordinates for the places and link data for people. Personally, I spent over 9 months full-time cleaning the people, so disambiguating and deduplicating. Josie Cree and Lotta Fickers spent a further 4 months disambiguating and deduplicating place names and geocoding them. The length of time was due to the fact that we took the decision to take an assisted manual approach using an interface we developed to check each name and place label against contextual information. This process is discussed further in a chapter at the bottom of this slide. Once we'd undertaken that onerous task, however, we not only knew our data really well, but we had network data that we felt comfortable about analysing. But how do you begin analysing a network of 20,000 people and over 132,000 letters? In our first project, we had clearly formed questions from the start about the organisation of the underground Protestant community. In this case, however, we wanted to first understand what was possible to ask about this data. And to do so, we needed to start to understand the contours of the 130,000 letters and to sift it in different ways to see trends and deviation. And for this reason, we built an exploratory tool. So this tool has various functionalities that I can go into further during the questions, but it uses 8 standard network metrics by which we can rank people. We can then set custom periods to sort people, so they could be the reign of a monarch, a decade, or the period of a Secretary of State in office, for example. And then we built in a graphing capability so that we could graph 2 network measures against one another. And I'm going to give a close study of one of those graphs in a moment. Once we find a person of interest by using these metrics and graphing capabilities, we can click on the name of a person and we get an individual view. That individual view, here Edward Courtney, contains their particular network metrics on the left-hand panel. In the middle panel, we have their variant names that have been created through the disambiguation process. And then in the middle and bottom panels of the middle section, we can see all of the people to whom Edward Courtenay wrote, and all the people from whom he received letters. By clicking on the numbers of letters, we can then look at the content, the described contents of the letters in the final right-hand panel, and even click on the image link to get the original scan of that letter. And what this tool enables then is what Martin Muller calls scalable reading, which allows you to move from that most distant quantitative view with the network metrics to an individual view, understanding the kind of texture of a given person's correspondence, down to the individual material documents that can be read in minute detail. A case for that kind of scalable reading in action can be seen from one of the auto-generated graphs we created from the front page, and which in fact acted as the starting point for our article, Metadata Surveillance and the Tudor State. To remind you, these graphs allow you to chart different measures against each other to see if there are correlations and deviations. And it's one of those ways we began by getting a feel for our data. This graph in particular charts a measure called degree, which we see along the bottom here, which is a proxy for the total number of correspondence a person has, against their betweenness ranking. So the closer to the bottom you are of this means the higher ranking you have for betweenness, so the more short paths go through you, and the further this way you move, the total number of, the larger the total number of connections you have. This is a graph for the 1580s, just for legibility, and what we can see is that this big splash of names up here are all the people who have absolutely zero short paths going through them, and they all correspond with just one single person. At the other extreme of the graph over here, we see Walsingham, who during the 1580s has a degree of 1100-ish, and he has the most short paths going through him, so he ranks top for betweenness. And between those two extremes, we see a diagonal trend, which suggests that the more people with whom you correspond, the more likely you are to have those short paths going through you in the network, giving you that greater infrastructural significance. What we're interested in are the outliers down here, people who have a surprisingly high infrastructural significance despite a relatively low number of connections. We wanted to know who those people were and why they had those features. And we can see that in the next slide. So when we look at those outliers, we begin to see an interesting pattern emerging. We see Anthony Standen over here, he was a spy. Thomas Morgan was a Catholic conspirator. Gilbert Gifford was a double agent working for the government and Catholic conspirators. Charles Paget, Catholic conspirator. Bernardino de Mendoza was an ambassador for Philip II, the Catholic monarch of Spain, and a conspirator. Francis Englefield, Catholic conspirator. And Andrea de Loo, he was actually a Flemish merchant and spy. We wondered, oh, is this an anomaly? Well, we looked at other graphs and we saw that the decades either side actually have a really similar pattern. So this is the 1590s, and we're seeing people like William Allen, who was a Catholic leader, Christopher Parkins, who was a Catholic turned double agent turned diplomat. We are seeing Robert Parsons, another Catholic conspirator and leader, Crichton, Catholic conspirator, John Snowden, double agent, Thomas Phillips, famous cryptographer and intelligence gatherer. John Daniel was a kind of aspiring intelligencer, and Henry St. Main was either a double agent or triple agent, depending on whose scholarship you subscribe to. Why are we seeing this pattern? When we look at the correspondence of each of these individuals, the reason that they have low degree and high betweenness becomes clear. So conspirators and intelligence gatherers tend to correspond with relatively few distinct people, but those communications bridge not only separate but actively opposed communities. This clustering of similar kinds of people in the same area of graph suggested to us that we could scale up this approach to more systematically search for people involved in similar activities. We wanted to see if the spies and the conspirators had a specific network profile, and if so, whether we could use it to predict other likely people holding those roles. To help us narrow down our search in the vast archive of 133,000 letters. So we developed what we call the find similar function that takes the 8 basic network measures listed across the top here and clusters people in 8-dimensional space based on the closeness of their scores for those 8 metrics. And you can see slightly different colors. So Pietro Bizzarri here, who we're looking for, he has very low eigenvector centrality. And so all of the people like him have that same feature. And we use this method, therefore, to understand commonalities in the network profiles between different kinds of people. So this ranked list of people on the screen right now are the 20 people most similar to Pietro Bizzarri, who was a historian, but used his position traveling on the continent to send back intelligence to the Secretaries of State in England. And what we can observe is that the 20 most similar figures to him include a whole range of people, including diplomats, military figures, foreign agents, and merchants. But what many of these figures have in common is that they served a role as intelligence tunnelers, sending information to the Tudor government. What we saw then is that this method allows us to understand what similar patterns of communication can tell us about people's function in the network. The work that I've presented up until this point is at the most abstract, stripped back level of the network analysis. It's interested in the existence of edges between people and the direction of those communications, the weight of communication passing along them. But it doesn't take into consideration either the contents of those letters or the geographical context of those communications. In terms of letter contents, we used quantitative patterns to guide our close human reading of the letters to understand the quantitative patterns we were observing. But this is not making full use either of the scale of the data we have or its breadth and potential. As part of our data, we have a description field for all letters which we can analyze, which summarizes often very fulsomely the content of the letter. One of the things we can do is to search the letter contents using our variant name lists created during the data cleaning process to see which of our correspondents are also mentioned in the letters. From this, we're able to create automated networks of mentions. In this image here, we can see an example of the discussion of a man called William Pickering, who was actually the resident diplomat in Paris until the beginning of Mary's reign, but sent no letters between the early days and the final year of her reign, so between 1553 and 1558. However, he is actually the subject of much discussion, following his involvement in a rebellion against the throne, following which he fled to the continent where he was then the subject of very anxious correspondence. Later letters then tell the story of his rehabilitation, going from the role of rebel to an informant against the other rebels, to a courier acting for the Tudor state, before being commissioned finally to go into Germany and raise an army in 1558. And you can see a bit more about his story in the article at the bottom of the screen. Essentially what we're doing with the Pickering case is tracing the dissemination of a given topic within the letter network. The edge is not the letter per se, but the topic. This works not only for people, but all kinds of news topics. The question, though, is how to discover the news items within the letters that are worthy of tracing. We don't want to go into the data with preconceptions. We began the process by generating automatic word graphs, which ranked words for their usage over time, so not using their raw count, but their ranking in terms of frequency used over time. And then we ordered those word profiles by the ones with the most change over time. A few examples can be seen here for the words Pickering in the top right, which we now know all about, the word rebellion in the bottom left, a word that peaks, unsurprisingly, during periods of rebellion, and the word Rome in the bottom right, which, as we might expect, declines after Henry's break with Rome, rises again during Mary I's Catholic reign, and again declines following Elizabeth I's succession to the throne. By identifying sharp peaks, we found this acted as a really useful proxy for finding time-bounded news items, and so we used this to find our case studies. We can then look at how those news items move through the network of correspondence. This is another auto-generated network graph that we can create for any word in our letter descriptions. And just an aside, the code for which we're going to make available with the book and the underlying data set when it's published next year. The blue in this graph signifies early communications getting redder over time. And what we actually are seeing here is the network of people talking about divorce in the period 1527 to 1536. And surprise, surprise, this is about Henry seeking to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. To understand what's going on here, on the left, we're seeing, this is Wolsey, the people he's talking to about, and this is Henry, and they're connecting down here with the nuncios and Pope, which goes off screen. Over on the other side of the screen, we have Charles V, who was the Holy Roman Emperor, and in fact, Catherine's nephew. On this bridge through the middle, we have Chapuis, who was Charles V's resident ambassador in England, and this is Catherine of Aragon herself. We can see very clearly the sides dramatized in this image and the diplomatic impact of breaking that tie between England and the Holy Roman Empire. By removing Catherine, what we essentially do is disconnect these two worlds, these two political realms. The geographical dimension is also crucial to consider in a communication network. We have 8,000 places from which letters were sent, which are standardized and linked to geolocations. But it gets more interesting by using this data at scale. If a person writes from more than one identified location, then we can reconstruct fragments of their itineraries. What we're seeing here is a prototype of an interactive visualization being developed for us by the genius, that is Kim Albrecht. By combining these separate itineraries, though, we can actually do something interesting to see who was in the same place at the same moment. Where do these itineraries intersect? Let us consider two individuals in the Tudor State Papers who wrote letters from different locations on subsequent dates. We can thus construct two itineraries. So in this case, we see the itinerary is intersected on April the 22nd. But what can we do with that information? Lists of intersections provide a way of showing a potential local network, but this needs to be validated. If two people's itineraries overlap, we can also see whether they, in addition, wrote to one another, and whether that was before and after their intersection, and whether they mention each other, and again, before or after they intersect. By using the disambiguated name list we have associated with every person and searching the letter descriptions again. Or there are all sorts of ways we can use this method, but if our interest is in adding links into a network that is not otherwise evidenced by letters, then we can use this information to understand possible interactions between people who never corresponded. We can also calculate a statistical estimate of the likelihood that two people are in the same place by chance. This allows us to focus on more unlikely intersections, which are in turn more likely to be historically significant. And our work using this method has shown that this ranked list of significant overlaps highlights things like wars and sieges. So the reason that 3 or 4 people might have been in a camp outside a very obscure French village. And similarly, the visitations associated with the dissolution of monasteries explains why a bunch of men were in a small Welsh village on a certain date. These methods work well for a large data set of over 130,000 letters. It makes it navigable. But there is potential to scale up even further. But what does that actually mean? To get to ever larger collections of letters means joining up multiple archives of letters. And this is the subject of our latest collaboration, the AHRC-funded project, Networking Archives. The project provides a working model for a meta-archive by bringing together the existing early modern letters online content, which is a union catalogue of over 100 catalogues of correspondence, including a very large core of metadata from the Bodleian card catalogue. EMLA has been collected for the purpose of understanding a very particular phenomenon, the Republic of Letters, although it makes no claims to representativeness. In addition, we're bringing in the Tudor data from the Tudor Networks of Power project and a third body of data, which is the State Papers online data covering the period 1603 to 1714. Bringing all those together is approaching the 500,000 mark of letters. And to bring these together, we not only have to repeat the process of internal data cleaning like we did for Tudor Networks of Power, but also match up those disambiguated people across collections. In doing so, however, we're going to create a centre of gravity for other early modern letter metadata, which can be added to and analysed thanks to the suite of tools that we have developed and are continuing to develop for data cleaning, reconciliation, and network analysis. But why bring these particular letter projects together apart from their rough chronological overlap? Now, the letter by design is a technology of dispersal. There have been efforts to reassemble the oeuvre of specific letter writers since time immemorial, and the impetus behind those traditional objects, the collected letters of person X. The result of such endeavours, however, creates a personal, ego-centred view of intellectual communities. The contention of this project is that if we get enough of those ego networks together with institutional archives, we can start to understand the intersections between intellectual and political circles previously obscured. The Republic of Letters is usually studied by one group of scholars and the State Papers by another group, but we know these worlds were not entirely separate, with key people popping up in both. But until now, there's been no way to see how thoroughly those worlds were actually intermeshed. The key concept underpinning our project is the overlap. It works on multiple scales in the project. The smallest scale is the overlap between two ego networks, which we can see here in this toy example, beautifully drawn by Jan Ryan, one of the project team. We can understand the extent to which two epistolary networks were enmeshed. So here we can imagine that person X and person Y never wrote to one another, but now we can understand that they share one correspondent. What does that connection tell us? And how would our inferences change if they corresponded with 100 people each, but shared 25 correspondents? We can take that abstract concept to think about some real correspondence in our archive. This is one of the author-generated diagrams that we use in the project to explore this method. Here we can see the overlaps between Samuel Hartlib, Isaac Vossius and his father Gerardus, and a fourth node, Comenius. This is a compressed network that shows the numbers of people who are shared by the different combinations of these nodes. The different sized white nodes, are scaled by the number of correspondents shared by these 4 people. So the Vossiuses, they share 41 people. Comenius and Hartlib, they share, I think this is 37 people up here. What we can see is that although all 4 men share many, many correspondents, Hartlib did not correspond directly with either Vossius. This absence is the subject of current work being undertaken in the project led by Howard Hodson and Esther van Ramsdonk. However, the concept of the overlap can also be scaled up. If we return to this toy figure, we can change the labels to read community X and community Y to understand how certain groupings or defined communities interrelated. Or, and this is the ultimate aim of the project, we can explore the extent to which 2 archives, Archive X and Archive Y, overlapped. To what extent does the part of the Republic of Letters that has been pieced together by the efforts of EMLO overlap with the people found in the State Papers archive? The intersection of this intellectual sphere and this political realm have never been systematically studied heretofore because of the barriers of technology and expertise. Having just finished the first pass through the disambiguation and deduplication of the Stuart State Papers, we're now beginning the process of reconciling people across our data sets, which means that very soon we'll be able to tell you how big that intersection actually is and what it meant for the dissemination of information in the early modern world. We're excited to share that in the coming months the fruits of these efforts, which should be able to appear in various forums in 2021. But we hope that this scope trajectory gives a sense of the scale of opportunities posed by network analysis for the study of historical communications. It gives us models for network analysis at different scales, models for scaling up and connecting multiple archives. But this is not just about early modern letters. The lessons that we can take are more general I'm excited about the way that these approaches can be adopted to think about the way that information moves between spheres, as well as where communication is not happening. Those fissures opening up between communities are as interesting as identifying shared connections. For those fissures are responsible for the kinds of impact that we are seeing in society right now, the opening gulf between the left and the right, between those with privilege and those whose lives have been affected by systematic inequalities that fall along the lines of race, gender, and sexuality. As part of this, we need to think too about whose voices are not being heard, those absences within the official record, and what we can do to recover those for a more inclusive history, and one that tries to set right the injustice of the past. Thank you very much for listening today.